Imagine you are standing in a small town in the American Midwest in the 1920s. You see a perfectly paved street, lined with white picket fences. There are neat wooden houses with porches, a local grocery store, and even a movie theater playing the latest silent films. You hear the sounds of children playing on a well-manicured lawn. You smell freshly baked bread and perhaps the scent of pine needles. It looks like a postcard from Michigan. But then, you look up, past the rooftops, past the Whitewater Tower. There is no Michigan skyline. Instead, there is a wall. A green, suffocating, vibrating wall of the densest tropical rainforest on the planet. The humidity is 90%. The temperature is 100 degrees. And the sound coming from that wall is not a lawnmower, but the collective roar of a billion insects. Howler monkeys and jaguars. This is Fordlandia. It is the town that shouldn't exist. It is the greatest monument to human arrogance in history. And it is the place where one of the richest men to ever live, Henry Ford, learned that you cannot use an assembly line to build a jungle. This is the story of an industrial utopia that became a biological tomb. To understand why a man from Detroit decided to build a city in the middle of the Brazilian Amazon, we have to talk about power. By the 1920s, Henry Ford was more than just a businessman. He was a global celebrity. He had revolutionized the world with the Model T. He had invented the $5 day. He had mastered the machine. Ford was a man who hated chaos. He hated waste. And most of all, he hated being told no. He wanted to control every single step of the manufacturing process. He owned the iron mines. He owned the coal fields. He owned the timber forests. He even owned the railroad that moved the parts. But there was one material he did not own. One material that stayed firmly in the hands of his rivals. Rubber. Every Model T needed tires. Every engine needed gaskets and hoses. And at that time, the British and the Dutch had a total stranglehold on the global rubber supply through their colonies in Asia. They controlled the prices, and Ford was getting tired of paying their bills. He remembered the story of Henry Wick, the man who stole the seeds from Brazil years before. Ford decided he didn't want to buy rubber from a middleman in London. He wanted to go back to the source. He wanted to go back to Brazil. In 1927, Ford secured a land grant of 2.5 million acres, roughly the size of the state of Connecticut, on the banks of the Tapajós River, a major tributary of the Amazon. He called it Fordlandia. His goal was simple: grow enough rubber to supply every Ford car in the world. And while he was at it, teach the people of the jungle how to be proper Americans. It was a mission of industry and a mission of morality, and it was doomed from the very first brick. Henry Ford was a man of the factory. He believed that if you had the right blueprint, the right tools, and a strict enough set of rules, you could overcome anything. But he forgot one very important thing. A tree is not a car part. The problem started immediately. Ford refused to hire a professional botanist or anyone who actually knew anything about the Amazonian climate. He thought that if his engineers could build a complex engine, they could certainly grow a tree. He sent a fleet of ships down to Brazil loaded with Michigan materials. He sent iron, cement, glass, and even the nails. He sent thousands of gallons of paint. He basically tried to mail a Midwestern city across the ocean and drop it into a swamp. When the workers arrived, they cleared the forest. They burned the ancient hardwoods to make room for the rubber clones. And then they built the town. They built a world-class hospital. They built schools. They built a massive powerhouse with a chimney that stood out above the trees like a giant finger pointing at the sky. They even built a golf course and a swimming pool. For a moment, it looked like Ford was winning. It looked like the machine was taming the wild. But then the rules started. You see, Henry Ford didn't just want rubber. He wanted to remake the people. He was a man of extreme discipline and very specific tastes. He was a vegetarian. He hated tobacco. He despised alcohol. He was a fan of square dancing. And he believed that everyone, regardless of where they lived, should live exactly like a worker in Hillsdale, Michigan. He forced his Brazilian workers, many of whom were used to working in the cooler hours of the morning and evening, to work a strict 9-to-5 shift. This was in the middle of the equatorial sun. They had to wear heavy, American-style uniforms. They were forced to live in tiny, standardized houses that had no ventilation because they were designed for the Michigan winter. In the 90-degree heat of Brazil, those houses became ovens. And then there was the food. Ford provided the meals. But instead of the local staples of fish, fruit, and beans, he served them brown rice, whole wheat bread, and oatmeal. He basically tried to turn hunters and gatherers into Michigan farmers, and he banned alcohol. Completely. He sent sociologists into the workers' homes to make sure they weren't drinking or smoking. He even forced the Brazilian laborers to attend weekly American square dancing sessions. Picture that for a second. Men who had spent all day clearing a jungle in the boiling heat, forced to put on clean shirts and dance to the fiddle music of the Midwest in a humid hall in the middle of nowhere. It was absurd. It was surreal. And it was the perfect recipe for a riot. The explosion happened in the cafeteria in 1930. One day, a worker had finally had enough of the brown rice and the oatmeal. He picked up his tray and smashed it. Within minutes, the entire cafeteria was in a state of chaos. The workers began to destroy the town. They smashed the time clocks. They threw the American food into the river. They chased the managers into the jungle. The breaking of the pans, they called it. The management had to escape on a ship and hide for days while the Brazilian army was called in to restore order. Ford's Utopia had its first taste of blood. But as bad as the riots were, the real killer wasn't the workers. It was something much smaller, something invisible. Something that Henry Ford couldn't argue with or fire. In his quest for industrial efficiency, Ford had made a fatal biological error. He had planted his rubber trees, hundreds of thousands of them, side by side in massive, dense rows. He thought this was productive. In his mind, more trees per acre meant more rubber. But in the Amazon, the hevea tree has a mortal enemy, the South American leaf blight. In the wild, these trees grow hundreds of yards apart from each other. This is nature's way of practicing social distancing. It prevents diseases from spreading from one tree to the next. By planting them in an assembly line grid, Ford had built a highway for the fungus. In 1935, the leaf blight hit Fordlandia with the force of a tidal wave. It started as tiny spots on a few leaves. Then, it spread to the whole tree. Then the next tree. And the next. Because all the trees were genetically identical clones, none of them had any resistance. It was a botanical apocalypse. The leaves withered. The branches turned into skeletal sticks. The rubber flow slowed to a trickle. Ford's managers panicked. They tried to spray chemicals. They tried to burn the infected trees. They even tried to move the entire project 60 miles downriver to a new site called Belterra, hoping the fungus wouldn't follow them. But the fungus was faster. It hitched a ride on the boots of the workers. It moved on the breeze. Nature was telling Henry Ford that his logic did not apply here. You can control a factory, but you cannot dictate the terms to an ecosystem. Despite losing millions of dollars every year, Ford refused to give up. He poured more money into the hole in the jungle. He never once visited the site himself. He just sat in Detroit and read the reports. He refused to admit that the master of the machine could be defeated by a tiny spore of mold. But eventually, reality caught up with him. By the 1940s, synthetic rubber was being developed in laboratories. The era of natural rubber was beginning to fade. In 1945, after 18 years of struggle and the loss of over $20 million, which would be nearly $300 million today, Henry Ford's grandson, Henry Ford II, finally pulled the plug. He sold the land back to the Brazilian government for a tiny fraction of what it was worth. The Americans left. They packed their bags, boarded their ships, and disappeared. They left the hospital behind. They left the school behind. They left the swimming pool to fill with algae and the powerhouse to rust in the humidity. Fordlandia was abandoned to the forest. Today, if you take a boat up the Tapajós River, you can still see the ruins. It is one of the most haunting sights in the world. You turn a corner in the river, expecting to see more green jungle, and suddenly, you see a massive, rusted American water tower rising above the trees like a ghost. You can walk through the streets where the white picket fences have long since been swallowed by the undergrowth. You can enter the hospital and see surgical tools from the 1930s lying on the floor, covered in dust. The Brazilian locals have moved into some of the old houses. They have painted them different colors. They play their own music. They have reclaimed the land. But the industrial skeleton of Ford's dream is still there. It is a monument to a man who thought he was bigger than the earth. Fordlandia is more than just a business failure. It is a perfect metaphor for the 20th century. We thought we could standardize the world. We thought we could replace the messy, chaotic beauty of nature with the clean, predictable lines of a machine. We thought we could make everyone dance to our tune. But nature is not a factory. It has its own rules, its own rhythms, and its own way of fighting back. When we talk about the green desert of modern rubber plantations in Asia, we are looking at a world that only exists because it hasn't met its leaf blight yet. We are looking at a system that is still trying to use the same logic that failed in the jungle. We are still living in Fordlandia. We just don't know it yet. Henry Ford spent his life trying to bring order to the world. He wanted everything to be efficient, uniform, and profitable. He wanted to build a world where every part fit perfectly into the next. But in the Amazon, he met the one thing he couldn't control. He met the soul of the forest, and the forest won. So, the next time you think that technology and money can solve any problem, think of the rusted chimney in the Tapajos. Think of the square dancing hall where only insects dance now. Think of the man who tried to put the Amazon on an assembly line and found out that life does not like to be organized into rows. The story of Fordlandia is a tragedy, but it's also a bit of a dark comedy. It's the story of a man who could build millions of cars but couldn't grow a single healthy tree. It's the story of how the smell of oatmeal in the morning became the scent of an empire's collapse. And it's a warning to us all. We are part of the ecosystem, not its managers. We can ignore the rules of the jungle for a while, but eventually the jungle always sends its bill. The ruins of Fordlandia are silent now. The fungus is still there, resting on the leaves of the wild trees, waiting for the next person who thinks they are smart enough to build a monoculture in its house. The monkeys have moved back into the trees above the golf course. The river keeps flowing, indifferent to the dreams of the men in Detroit. And the Whitewater Tower keeps rusting, a quiet sentinel overlooking a ghost town that serves as a tombstone for industrial pride. We should listen to the silence of Fordlandia. It has a lot to tell us about who we are and what we have forgotten. It tells us that power without wisdom is just a slow way to build a ruin. It tells us that the world is more complex than a blueprint, and most of all, it tells us that even the strongest steel eventually turns to dust when it tries to hold back the green tide of the wild. So keep your assembly lines for your machines. But for the forest, you need humility, you need respect, and you need to know when to let the jungle just be the jungle. Because if you don't, you might find yourself in a town with a white picket fence, watching as the walls of the world start to close in, and the music of the square dance fades into the dark, relentless hum of the wild. Thanks for coming on this journey with me through the heart of the Amazon and the center of human hubris. Let's keep looking at the maps, but let's always remember to check what's growing in the shadows. The world is a wild place, and I, for one, am glad it is. Until next time, stay curious and maybe, just maybe, skip the oatmeal today.